somewhere inside your genome right now, hiding between, the strings of code that determine the color of your eyes or the shape of your jaw, are fragments of DNA that belong to a ghost.
A literal genetic ghost.
Yeah.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's completely mind-blowing. I am talking about an entirely unknown alien species of ancient human. And we have never found a single fossil for them.
Right, no skulls.
No teeth, no jawbones in the dirt, nothing. The only proof we have that this, parallel humanity ever existed is that hundreds of thousands of years ago, they met your direct ancestors somewhere on the plains of Africa, and they mated with them.
Leaving this microscopic permanent signature inside your blood today.
Exactly. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're taking on a massive mission for you, the listener. We're going to reconstruct the messy, mind-bending, and constantly shifting story of human origins.
Yeah, because it is definitely not the clean story we all learned in high school.
Not at all. And to do this, we've gathered a really fascinating stack of sources. We're pulling from the latest reporting from PBS News, detailed fossil analyses from the Natural History Museum.
Plus some incredibly dense genetic sequencing studies from the National Human Genome Research Institute.
Oh yeah, those are heavy. And we've got comprehensive syntheses of evolutionary models from Wikipedia, too. Our goal is to take all of this conflicting data and synthesize it so you can actually understand the mechanics of how your ancestors evolved and basically conquered the globe.
And to do that, we really have to start by just clearing the slate. Anyone who follows anthropology or genetics even casually knows that the classic March of Progress illustration is totally obsolete.
Right, the neat little single-file line of apes slowly standing upright and turning into a modern human.
Yeah, that one. It's completely wrong. But what we're grappling with today goes far beyond just debunking that old poster. The cutting edge of paleoanthropology is currently trapped in this profound tension.
A massive collision.
Exactly. We have the story told by ancient, fragmented bones pulled from the earth, and we have the story told by the microscopic data of modern DNA sequencing. And those two stories are, they're violently colliding right now.
Okay, let's unpack this, because my enthusiasm for diving into the sheer chaos of this collision just cannot be contained.
I can tell.
If we want to understand how we got here, we have to look at the very foundation of the story, which for decades was the idea of a single cradle of mankind.
Right, the textbook narrative.
Yeah, that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, just sprang into existence in one highly specific location. Usually they pinpointed it somewhere in the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, like Ethiopia, around maybe 200,000 years ago.
And from that one specific valley, we supposedly spread out.
But to dismantle that entirely, we are traveling back to the year 1961. To a dusty barite mining operation in a place called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco.
Yeah, so picture the scene here. It's a rugged, arid landscape. Miners are out there using picks and heavy machinery to extract barite, which is a mineral used in oil drilling.
Right.
And in the process of just tearing into this hillside, one of the miners strikes something unusual. It's not barite. It's a fossilized human skull.
Wow.
So they bring it out, dust it off, and eventually it makes its way to the scientific community. Now, at the time, in the early 60s, paleoanthropologists took a look at the heavy brow ridges and the elongated shape of the skull, and they effectively just shrugged.
They just brushed it off.
Pretty much. They categorized it as an African variant of a Neanderthal. They estimated it to be, maybe 40,000 years old.
Just a mere footnote in the fossil record. They assumed it was a strange, isolated cousin who somehow wandered down into North Africa.
Right. But then, as dating techniques improved a few decades later, scientists took another look. They revised the age to about 160,000 years old.
Which is a huge jump.
It is. And they updated the classification, begrudgingly admitting, okay, this might actually be an early Homo sapiens. But it was a massive headache for the establishment.
Because it was in Morocco.
Exactly. Thousands of miles away from the supposed East African Garden of Eden. So it was treated as this bizarre outlier that just didn't fit their neat and tidy model.
And that dismissive attitude held on for a long time. Until a team led by Jean-Jacques Hubrin from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology decided to revisit Jebel Irhoud.
A really crucial turning point.
They went back to a section of the site that the original barite miners had miraculously left completely undisturbed. And this new excavation, which culminated in a blockbuster paper published in Nature in it completely upended our understanding of human origins.
Because they didn't just find one skull this time.
No, they uncovered a whole trove of hominin fossils, jawbones, teeth, long bones from multiple individuals, and they were all intermingled with animal bones and, crucially, burnt stone tools.
Yeah, the burnstone tools are the absolute key that unlocks this entire mystery, specifically because of a technique called thermoluminescence dating.
Oh, I love this part. For the listener, let's break down how this actually works, because it sounds like science fiction, but it's based on the fundamental physics of dirt.
It really is. So when you have a piece of flint, its crystalline structure isn't perfect. It has these tiny microscopic defects.
Flaws in the crystal.
Right. And over thousands of years, background radiation from naturally occurring isotopes in the surrounding soil, things like uranium, thorium, and potassium, they constantly bombard that flint.
It's just sitting there absorbing radiation.
Yes, and this radiation knocks electrons out of their normal atomic orbits. These wandering electrons get trapped inside those structural defects in the crystal lattice.
Think of those structural defects as like tiny microscopic buckets slowly filling up with water. The longer the flint sits in the radioactive soil, the more trapped electrons accumulate inside the buckets.
That is a perfect analogy. Now, the genius of thermoluminescence dating is what happens when early humans interact with that flint. Let's say a hunter at Jebel Irhoud uses a flint tool and then drops it into their campfire.
Accidentally or on purpose.
Exactly. The heat from the fire, which reaches temperatures of over 400 degrees Celsius, provides enough energy to free those trapped electrons. They escape from the structural defects, and as they return to their normal orbits, they release a tiny flash of light.
So the fire effectively empties the buckets. It zeroes the clock completely.
Zeroes the clock,
Yeah.
and then the tool gets buried in the dirt after the fire goes out.
And the slow, invisible bombardment of soil radiation begins filling those microscopic electron traps all over again from scratch.
Precisely, that's the mechanism. So when Hubland's team excavated those burnt flint tools, they brought them into a pitch-black laboratory. They carefully crushed them and heated them up on a specialized plate.
And as the flint heated, it released light.
Exactly. By measuring the exact intensity of that light, using highly sensitive photomultiplier tubes, and comparing it to the known background radiation of the Jebel Irhoud soil, the team could calculate exactly how long it had been since that flint was last heated in a prehistoric campfire.
It's just brilliant. And the number that the laboratory spit out was an absolute bombshell. These tools, and the human fossils buried right alongside them, weren't 40,000 years old.
Nope.
They weren't 160,000 years old either. The thermoluminescence dating placed them between 350,000 and 280,000 years ago.
Which is just staggering.
Hmm.
In a single publication, Hubland's team pushed the origin of our species back by more than 100,000 years.
They nearly doubled the timeline of Homo sapiens overnight.
The magnitude of that chronological leap is hard to overstate. But the date is only half the story here, because the morphological features of these fossils present an even deeper puzzle.
Yeah, the shapes of the bones themselves.
Exactly. If you read the detailed analyses from the Natural History Museum, they describe what is basically a physiological contradiction.
Right. If you were to magically resurrect one of these individuals from Jebel Irhoud, put them in modern clothes, and look at them face to face on the subway, you likely wouldn't even give them a second glance.
You really wouldn't. They possessed a short, tucked-in, relatively delicate face. They had small cheekbones and a jawline that is unmistakably modern.
But if they turned around to look out the subway window, you would immediately notice something completely alien about the back of their head.
You definitely would, because the brain case, the protective vault of bone housing the brain, was elongated. It was low and flattened.
It wasn't round.
No, it completely lacked the high, rounded, bulbous shape that characterizes every single human alive today. It was, in paleoanthropological terms, highly archaic.
And this brings us to a concept that completely breaks the old-school linear view of evolution: mosaic evolution.
A really crucial concept.
I love this because it explains so much of the fossil record's weirdness. We have this deep-seated intuition that a species evolves in unison, right? Like, if you were becoming a new species, your whole body upgrades to the new version at the exact same time.
Like a software update for the whole organism.
Exactly. But mosaic evolution proves that different parts of an organism's anatomy evolve at completely different rates, totally independent of one another. For the Jebel Irhoud population, the face reached the finish line of modernity hundreds of thousands of years before the brain case caught up.
And what's fascinating here is the underlying biological implication of that shape change. Because the transition from an elongated, primitive brain case to a globular, rounded one It isn't just about the external bone,
It's about what's inside.
right? It reflects a fundamental reorganization of the brain's internal architecture. A globular skull houses a brain with expanded parietal and cerebellar regions.
And those are important for what, exactly?
Well, the cerebellum, which is tucked at the back and bottom of the brain, is highly involved in motor control, but also in higher cognitive functions, things like language processing, working memory, and social cognition.
Oh, wow.
And the parietal lobes are crucial for spatial orientation and sensory integration. So the Jebel-Irhoud humans had our faces, but their neural networks, the actual physical wiring of their cognition, were still in a state of profound transition.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though, because the sources we're using highlight a very fierce pushback from other experts in the field, specifically paleoanthropologist John Hawkes.
Yes, Hawks has some very strong reservations.
Right. Hawkes looks at this mixture of traits and raises a massive red flag. He points out that having a modern-looking face isn't necessarily a new trait. In fact, if we look at a much older species found in Spain called Homo antecessor,
Which lived around 800,000 years ago.
exactly 500,000 years earlier, they also had surprisingly modern, delicate faces.
They did. It's a striking similarity.
So Hawkes' question is, if the Jebel-Irhoud fossils have primitive, archaic brain cases, and their faces look suspiciously like this much older Homo antecessor species, how do we know they are actually us?
How do we confidently attach the label Homo sapiens?
Exactly. How do we know they aren't just a dead-end cousin lineage that happened to retain an old facial structure while their brains stayed primitive? I kind of think of it like finding a vintage 1960s Mustang in a barn. You open the door, and someone has installed a brand new touchscreen stereo system.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Is it a modern car because of the stereo, or is it an old car with a slight, superficial upgrade?
The Mustang analogy strikes at the very heart of the taxonomic crisis biology is currently facing. Paleoanthropologist Marta Lahr eloquently describes this as a profound definitional dilemma.
What actually defines us?
Exactly. What specific biological feature gives us the right to define our species? Is it the globular skull, which suggests the threshold of cognitive architecture and neural organization?
Because if we draw the line at the brain case, then the Jebel-Irhoud population are not Homo sapiens.
They're not. They would be an advanced cousin, perhaps a sister lineage. But if a small, retracted face, a specific dental pattern, and a lighter jaw are the defining hallmarks of our lineage, then they belong squarely within our species. They would mark the very beginning of our specific evolutionary trajectory.
The material culture they left behind makes drawing that line even harder, honestly. Because Hubland's team didn't just find bones, they found the technology these people were using. And it wasn't primitive rock smashing.
Far from it.
They found Middle Stone Age tools manufactured using the Levallois method. Let's really dig into what that means, because the Levallois technique is a quantum leap in cognitive capability.
It truly is a paradigm shift in toolmaking.
Prior to this, earlier human species would basically take a rock and bash it against another rock until a sharp edge formed. It was functional, sure, but rudimentary.
The Levallois method requires an entirely different psychological approach. The toolmaker has to hold a raw cobble of flint and conceptualize the final product, a sharp, perfectly proportioned flake hidden inside the stone, before they even strike the first blow.
So they're visualizing it first.
Yes. They carefully strike dozens of small flakes off the edges and the top surface to shape the core into a specific geometric form. It often resembles an overturned tortoise shell.
Okay, I can picture that.
Then they prepare a very specific striking platform at one end. Finally, with one precise, calculated blow to that platform, they detach a large, incredibly sharp, predetermined flake.
It requires working memory. It requires an understanding of fracture mechanics, geometry, and hierarchical planning, knowing that step 1 and 2 are necessary for step 5 to work.
You are predicting the future state of the stone.
And finding these highly advanced, cognitively demanding tools at a 300,000-year-old site in Morocco means that this level of complex thought was present in individuals whose brains hadn't even finished rounding out into the modern shape.
It forces us to decouple technological advancement from brain shape. If an elongated, archaic brain can conceive of and execute the Levallois method, it drastically complicates our assumptions about intelligence and human evolution.
It really does. But beyond the tools, the most disruptive implication of the Jebel-Irhoud discovery is geographic. By placing early Homo sapiens in the far northwest corner of Africa 300,000 years ago, it shatters the idea of an East African Garden of Eden.
Completely shatters it. It points instead to a Pan-African evolution.
And to visualize this, we have to look at paleoclimatology. If you look at the Sahara Desert today, it is a formidable, impassable ocean of sand. 3 million square miles of brutal, arid wasteland.
It's a massive barrier.
But 300,000 years ago, the Earth's orbital dynamics were different. The African monsoon system shifted significantly northward, and the Sahara was entirely green.
A completely different world.
It was a lush, vibrant environment crisscrossed by massive river networks and enormous freshwater lakes, some larger than the Great Lakes in North America. We are talking about an environment teeming with hippos, crocodiles, and grazing herds.
In that environmental context, early human populations were not trapped in isolated pockets like the East African Rift Valley. The greening of the Sahara removed the geographic barriers.
They could just walk across it.
Exactly. Small bands of early Homo sapiens or their immediate ancestors were highly mobile. They were roaming, hunting, and crucially, encountering other bands across the entire African continent.
Africa itself was the cradle.
The whole continent. Populations in the south, the east, and the north were exchanging genetic material and cultural innovations over tens of thousands of years. A beneficial mutation arising in South Africa could, over generations, flow through the connected grasslands all the way up to Morocco.
We didn't evolve in one place. We evolved everywhere in Africa simultaneously as an interconnected web of populations.
Yeah, that's the Pan-African theory in a nutshell.
But if our origins are scattered all across a green, wet, continent-spanning web, it forces a massive logistical question. How does a population that dispersed suddenly organize a unified exit strategy to conquer the rest of the globe?
Right, because clearly we made it out.
We're sitting here today on every continent, and to track that migration, we have to transition away from looking at ancient bones buried in the sand. The bones are too fragmented, they're too rare. To trace the ultimate coastal road trip out of Africa, we have to look at the microscopic code hiding in our blood.
Because for the last few decades, the dominant framework in anthropology for explaining how we populated the globe has been the recent African origin model, which is commonly referred to as the out-of-Africa theory.
Everyone's heard of out of Africa.
Exactly. The core premise is elegant in its simplicity. Anatomically, modern humans evolved in Africa, and then, relatively recently, between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, they expanded outward into Eurasia, replacing all other archaic hominins, like the Neanderthals in Europe and Homo erectus in Asia.
But before we get to that successful exit, we have to acknowledge the false starts. The archaeological record is literally littered with the tragic evidence of what scientists call the failed waves.
Yeah, the attempts that just didn't make it.
Our ancestors didn't just wait around until 70,000 years ago to peek outside the continent. They tried to leave constantly. The sources highlight modern human fossils found at Omo Kibish in Ethiopia, dating back 233,000 years.
Right.
We have skulls found in Abedima Cave in Greece that date to 210,000 years ago. There are modern human jawbones in Mislia Cave in Israel from 185,000 years ago, and even stone tools deep in the Arabian Peninsula at Jebel Faya in the UAE dating to 127,000 years ago.
These discoveries show this incredible restless energy. Small bands of early humans were constantly pushing the boundaries, moving up through the Levant and into the Middle East and Southern Europe.
But the crucial takeaway is that these early pioneer populations didn't leave a lasting genetic legacy. They were dead ends.
Completely. They pushed out into these new territories and eventually went extinct.
So why did they fail? Was it just bad luck or what?
It was really a combination of brutal ecological barriers and fierce competition. When those early waves pushed into Eurasia, they weren't entering an empty landscape. They were walking into territories deeply occupied by Neanderthals.
Oh, right, the locals.
And Neanderthals were apex predators, incredibly robust, culturally sophisticated. And most importantly, they had spent hundreds of thousands of years biologically adapting to the freezing, brutal conditions of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia.
So our early, tropical adapted ancestors simply couldn't outcompete them when the climate fluctuated towards severe cold.
Precisely. The pioneer Homo sapiens populations retreated or died off, and the Neanderthals reclaimed the territory.
So something monumental had to have shifted between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago to allow one specific group to finally break out and make it stick. And we know the precise timeline of this successful wave, not from finding a lucky fossil, but from cutting-edge genetic sequencing data provided by the National Human Genome Research Institute.
Which is where things get really mathematical.
To understand this, we need to dive into the mathematics of molecular clocks, specifically looking at the Y chromosome.
The Y chromosome is a unique piece of our genome because it is passed down exclusively from father to son, largely intact, without recombining or mixing with the mother's DNA.
No shuffling the deck.
Right, no shuffling. The only changes that occur generation after generation are random natural mutations. Think of them as tiny, inevitable typos in the genetic code. A single letter of DNA, a single nucleotide, swapped out by mistake during cell division.
Let's look at the specific studies from our sources. A team from Stanford University sequenced the Y chromosomes of 69 males from incredibly diverse indigenous populations across the globe.
Just 69, but from very distinct lineages.
Exactly. They used a mathematical algorithm to scan the entire sequence looking for these specific typos, known as single nucleotide variants, or SNVs. Out of millions of base pairs, they identified 11,640 of these variants.
A huge data set of typos.
And simultaneously, an independent team from Italy looked at a massive sample of 1,204 males exclusively from Sardinia, and they found 11,763 variants.
The beauty of this data is how scientists use it to turn back time. Because these typos accumulate at a known, relatively constant rate, like the ticking of a metronome. Geneticists can use them as a molecular clock.
That's so clever.
It is. If you compare the Y chromosome of a man from indigenous Australia with a man from West Africa, and you count the exact number of mutational differences between them, you can calculate mathematically how many thousands of years it has been since they shared a common ancestor.
And by running this calculation across all global populations, both the Stanford and the Sardinian studies arrived at the exact same point in time.
They traced all 11,000 plus variants backward until the lines converged on a single individual, the most recent common male ancestor of every single human being alive today.
The geneticists call him Y chromosomal Adam, and the molecular clock places him living in Africa somewhere between 120,000 and 200,000 years ago.
And we see the exact same pattern when we look at the female equivalent. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively from mother to child. Tracing its mutation rate backward leads us to mitochondrial Eve, the mother of all living maternal lineages.
And the studies confirm that Adam and Eve lived roughly during the same broad time period in Africa.
They did.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the moment you say the words Adam and Eve, the listener immediately pictures the biblical story, right? You imagine two lonely individuals, the first and only humans, walking around an empty African savanna.
Yes, which is a very common visualization.
But that is a massive, fundamental misconception of population genetics. I want to offer an analogy to clarify this for you guys. Think of the genetic mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, not as the first humans, but simply as the only two lottery winners whose tickets didn't get lost over a span of 300,000 years.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. During the time of Y chromosomal Adam, there were thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of other early human males living alongside him. They were hunting, migrating, having children.
So why are they the only ones we trace back to?
Well, over the course of thousands of generations, lineages experience statistical pruning. A man might have only daughters, meaning his specific Y chromosome dies out right there.
Oh, true.
Another family line might be wiped out by disease or famine. Over hundreds of millennia, through sheer statistical probability, every other male lineage from that ancient population went extinct. Adam's specific Y chromosome is just the only unbroken thread that randomly managed to survive to the present day.
So we have this massive, interconnected African population carrying these lineages. How does the exit actually happen? Well, around 135,000 years ago, the paleoclimate shifted dramatically again.
The environment turned on them.
The glorious green Sahara began to collapse. Severe megadroughts hit the continent. The massive megalakes dried up into literal dust bowls. The forests retreated. Human populations were squeezed, forced to abandon the interior and migrate toward the coastlines just to survive.
Because on the coast, they could rely on more stable marine resources like shellfish.
Right, and this coastal adaptation is critical. By the time we reach the window of 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, a tiny group of humans, some genetic estimates suggest it could have been an incredibly vulnerable bottleneck of as few as 150 to 1,000 individuals found themselves standing on the shores of the Red Sea.
Just a tiny handful of people. And this specific group carried a distinct genetic marker, a mutation in their mitochondrial DNA known as haplogroup L3.
Which is huge. Every single person alive today whose ancestry originates outside of Africa carries a descendant of this exact L3 marker.
Every single one.
This tiny group of maybe a few hundred people carrying the L3 marker stood at the edge of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which translates ominously to the Gate of Grief.
A very fitting name.
Today, if you look at a map, that strait separating Djibouti in Africa from Yemen in the Arabian Peninsula is 20 kilometers wide, and it is filled with treacherous, churning currents. It looks like an impossible barrier for prehistoric people. But again, environmental context is everything.
Exactly. Because 50,000 years ago, the Earth was locked in the grip of a deep glacial period, an ice age. Millions of cubic miles of ocean water were frozen and locked up in massive continental ice sheets covering North America and northern Europe.
And because so much water was trapped in ice, global sea levels were drastically lower, up to 70 meters lower than they are today. The continental shelves were totally exposed.
So the Bab el-Mandeb Strait wasn't a 20-kilometer expanse of deep, turbulent ocean. The drop in sea level exposed land bridges and transformed the strait into a much narrower, shallower channel dotted with islands.
Island hopping.
Exactly. This small, desperate band of humans, already adapted to coastal living and utilizing marine resources, could have island hopped across the strait using rudimentary rafts, or even by swimming during low tides.
It was a monumental bottleneck event. The genetic diversity of the entire non-African world was squeezed through that narrow geographical funnel.
And there is a fascinating ongoing debate in the scientific community about exactly when this crossing happened in relation to one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in Earth's history.
The Toba supervolcanic eruption.
Yes.
Around 74,000 years ago, a massive volcano named Mount Toba erupted in Indonesia. It was an apocalyptic event. It ejected thousands of cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere, plunging the entire planet into a volcanic winter that lasted for years, followed by a cooling period that may have lasted for centuries.
A global disaster.
So the debate is, did our ancestors carrying the L3 haplogroup cross the Red Sea before the ash blotted out the sun, or did they cross after the disaster, migrating into a devastated, recovering landscape?
The current genetic evidence tracking the mutation rates of haplogroup L3 suggests the successful expansion happened shortly after the Toba bottleneck.
Okay.
But regardless of the exact timing, once this small band crossed into the Arabian Peninsula, their expansion was explosive. Because they were coastal foragers, they essentially hugged the shoreline.
This is known as the southern root dispersal.
Right. They moved rapidly along the coast of the Indian Ocean, utilizing a continuous kelp highway of seafood. We actually find 125,000-year-old shell middens, basically ancient trash heaps of oyster and clam shells in Eritrea, proving how deeply adapted they were to this lifestyle.
And this rapid coastal migration allowed them to completely bypass the freezing Neanderthal-dominated interior of Eurasia,
They just skipped it entirely.
moving incredibly fast along the beaches of India and Southeast Asia. They island hopped across the Indonesian archipelago and managed to reach the continent of Australia somewhere between 65,000 and 50,000 years ago.
An epic transcontinental journey accomplished in just a few thousand years.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, an offshoot of this coastal group turned north, moving up through the Levant, adapting to the cold, and eventually populating Europe around 45,000 years ago as the Cro-Magnons.
The genetics paint an incredibly elegant picture here. The molecular clocks, the bottleneck at the Red Sea, the rapid coastal expansion, it all aligns beautifully. It provides a clean, mathematical explanation for how a single African population colonized the globe.
It is mathematically beautiful, and this is but if the out-of-Africa genetic narrative is so ironclad, so clean, we have to pause and ask a deeply critical question.
Which is?
Why did serious, world-renowned paleoanthropologists argue for decades, and in some circles, continue to argue for a completely different theory of human origins?
Right.
They weren't ignoring the science. They were looking at a different set of data, the bones in the ground. The actual fossils discovered in Asia and Europe stubbornly refused to fit the geneticists' neat and tidy out-of-Africa replacement narrative.
Which brings us to the great counter-narrative of the late 20th century, the multi-regional hypothesis.
Yes.
To understand this debate, we really have to rewind to 1984. A paleoanthropologist named Milford Wolpoff, collaborating with Alan Thorne and Xinzi Wu, looked at the global fossil record and proposed a model that directly challenged the idea of a recent single-source replacement.
But before we explain what Wolpoff argued, we desperately need to clarify what he was not arguing, because the multi-regional hypothesis is one of the most heavily misunderstood theories in science.
Absolutely. The multi-regional hypothesis is not parallel evolution. It does not argue that humans evolved independently from different ape ancestors in different parts of the world.
Let's be very clear on that.
Wolpoff has spent his entire career vehemently defending his theory against associations with earlier, highly discredited, and deeply racist models, such as polygenism or the theories of Carlton Kuhn.
Right. Kuhn argued that different human races evolved into modern intelligence at completely different times, which was a framework used to justify racial hierarchy.
Exactly. Wolpoff's model is the exact opposite of that. It is fundamentally a model of global unity.
Right. The multi-regional model argues that human evolution has been a single, continuous, worldwide species ever since an earlier ancestor, Homo erectus, first marched out of Africa almost 2 million years ago.
Yes.
Wolpoff looked at the data and said, yes, Homo erectus left Africa, spread into Europe, into the freezing steppes of Asia, down into tropical Indonesia. But they didn't branch off into entirely different species that eventually went extinct.
They stayed connected.
Instead, slowly, over millions of years, that entire sprawling global population evolved together into anatomically modern Homo sapiens, not by one group replacing the others, but by evolving in tandem.
And the physical evidence Wolpoff and his colleagues pointed to support this massive claim was the presence of what they called morphological clades.
Morphological clades, okay.
A clade in this context refers to specific, highly regional anatomical quirks, the shape of a cheekbone, the angle of a tooth that seemingly persist in the fossil record of a specific geographic area for over 1 million years.
Let's look at the specific examples from the sources because they are pretty compelling. In China, paleoanthropologists have excavated fossils of Homo erectus, the famous Peking man specimens dating back hundreds of thousands of years.
Very famous specimens.
These ancient skulls exhibit a distinct flatness to the upper face and heavily marked, shovel-shaped incisors. The back of the front teeth literally has raised margins, creating a shovel-like depression.
And Wolpoff pointed out that if you look at modern human populations in East Asia today, you see a high frequency of those exact same facial flatnesses and shovel-shaped incisors. To him, that suggested a direct, unbroken ancestral line right there in China.
And you see the exact same continuity argument applied to Australasia by Alan Thorne. Thorne analyzed a Homo erectus skull found in Indonesia known as Sangiran 17, which is roughly 1 million years old.
Okay.
He compared its architecture to a much younger modern human skull found in Australia known as Cow Swamp 1, which is only about 10,000 to 20,000 years old.
A huge time gap.
Huge gap. But Thorne noted that the excessive prognathism, the severe forward-jutting angle of the lower face and jaw, along with the specific angle of the brow ridges, matched almost seamlessly across a gap of nearly 1 million years.
And in Europe, the anthropologist David Frere looked at the Neanderthals. Neanderthals have very specific cranial features, like the suprainiac fossa.
The what?
The suprainiac fossa, it's a small, distinct oval depression on the occipital bone at the very back of the skull. And they also have a specific narrowing of the internal nasal cavity to warm freezing air. Frere argued that he could see echoes of these specific Neanderthal traits persisting right into the skulls of the later Cro-Magnons. The supposedly new modern humans who were supposed to have completely replaced them without mixing.
So the multi-regionalists looked at this regional continuity of traits in China, in Australia, in Europe, and concluded that the out-of-Africa replacement theory simply couldn't explain it. If a new population swept out of Africa 50,000 years ago and completely wiped out Peking man's descendants and completely wiped out the Neanderthals, why do the modern people in those regions still carry the architectural ghosts of those ancient indigenous skulls?
The very fair question to ask.
But I have to throw a massive wrench into this machinery here, because when you step back and look at the logistics of the multi-regional model, it seems mechanically impossible.
Mechanically, how so?
How could a population of hominins surviving in Ice Age Europe, a completely separate population living in the tropical jungles of Indonesia, and a third population living on the savannas of Africa, stay the exact same species for 2 million years?
The geographic distances are just incomprehensible.
Right. The environmental pressures are totally different. I think of it like a massive global game of genetic telephone. If a beneficial genetic mutation, say a larger brain, happens in a tribe in South Africa, how on earth does that mutation make its way to a tribe in northern China without the signal dropping.
Without those vast separated populations eventually getting genetically cut off from one another and branching into completely different species.
Exactly.
And that is precisely the attack leveled by critics of the multi-regional theory. How do you prevent speciation over such vast distances?
Did they have an answer?
They did. The answer the multi-regionalists provided was an elegant population genetics framework developed by Alan Thorne, known as the center and edge model.
Okay, the center and edge model.
Thorne argued that we shouldn't picture isolated populations sealed off from one another. Instead, picture a continuous, albeit incredibly slow, churning network of gene flow across the entire Pleistocene world.
So a world without hard borders.
Exactly that. Populations living on the extreme edges of the human range, say the Neanderthals in the freezing west or Homo erectus in the eastern jungles, would naturally develop distinct local adaptations to survive those extreme environments.
These are the regional quirks Wolpoff identified.
Yes. However, human beings are inherently mobile and deeply social. Tribes at the edges intermingled with tribes closer to the center. Individuals migrated, traded, and mated across the boundaries of their immediate territories.
So even if a tribe in Europe never directly met a tribe in China, they were connected by a chain of 1,000 tribes stretching across Central Asia and the Middle East.
Yes. This constant generation-over-generation gene flow acted as a biological glue. It was a slow, agonizingly gradual exchange of genetic material, but it was enough to keep the entire global population tethered together on a single evolutionary trajectory.
Wow.
It allowed beneficial global traits like increasing brain size and complex tool use to ripple across the world while still allowing the retention of localized regional adaptations.
It's an incredibly poetic idea, this unified, churning mass of humanity slowly elevating itself together over millions of years. But the reality is, the brutal mathematical precision of the genetic data we discussed earlier, the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, tracing all living humans back to a single recent exit from Africa, effectively crushed the pure multi-regional theory.
The molecular clock is just too loud to ignore. We are a recently emerged species. We did not evolve globally over 2 million years.
Right. The pure multi-regional model lost the war. But if we step back and connect this to the bigger picture, Milford Wolpoff, Alan Thorne, and the proponents of multi-regionalism were actually right about one massive, fiercely contested, and highly controversial mechanism of human history.
The biggest one.
They were right about interbreeding.
They were fundamentally right about interbreeding. For decades, the out-of-Africa proponents argued for strict total replacement. They argued that when anatomically modern humans expanded out of Africa, their superior technology and cognition allowed them to completely outcompete and wipe out the Neanderthals and Homo erectus.
And they did so without ever mating with them.
Right. But the multi-regionalists stared at the fossil record and insisted that the ancient, archaic humans had to have contributed to the modern gene pool. The bones showed a blending of traits.
The tension between these two grand theories, strict replacement versus regional continuity and interbreeding, seemed like a debate that would just never be resolved. It was just scientists arguing over the shakes of dusty skulls forever.
Until the technology caught up, and scientists figured out how to extract DNA directly from the ancient pulverized bones themselves.
Which ushers us into our final paradigm shift, the assimilation synthesis. This is where we finally learn that we are not a pure lineage, we are a genetic mosaic.
The paradigm shift that occurred in the early 2010s cannot be overstated in its importance. It is one of the greatest technical achievements in the history of biology.
It really is.
Led by geneticist Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute, who eventually won a Nobel Prize for this work, scientists accomplished the impossible. They took fragments of Neanderthal bone from caves in Europe, bones that were tens of thousands of years old, severely degraded, and heavily contaminated by soil bacteria, and even the DNA of the archaeologists who handled them.
Extracting that DNA is like trying to read a book that has been put through a shredder, soaked in water, and then mixed into a pile of dirt.
It's a monumental computational and biochemical challenge. But using advancements in next-generation sequencing, Pääbo's team managed to isolate the authentic Neanderthal DNA fragments, piece them together, and sequence the entire Neanderthal genome.
Incredible.
And when they finally placed the Neanderthal genome next to the genome of modern humans to compare them, the strict out-of-Africa replacement model collapsed overnight.
Just boom, gone.
The data proved definitively that Homo sapiens did not simply replace archaic humans when they entered Eurasia. They met them, they lived alongside them, and they slept with them.
The numbers are staggering to think about. For the listener, if you were listening to this right now and you have any non-African ancestry, if your ancestors are European, Asian, Native American, or Polynesian, your genome contains roughly 2 to 3% Neanderthal DNA.
You carry the physical code of the Neanderthals inside your cells.
But it gets even crazier. Because while they were digging in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia called Denisova Cave, scientists found a tiny, unassuming pinky bone and a single molar tooth.
And when Beebo's team extracted the DNA from that tiny pinky bone, expecting it to be either a Neanderthal or a modern human, the sequence shocked them.
It was something else entirely.
It didn't match us.
Right.
And it didn't match the Neanderthals. It was a completely new, previously unknown, highly divergent species of human. We had no complete skulls, no skeletons, just a genetic sequence and a finger bone. We named them the Denisovans.
And when geneticists took that Denisovan genome and compared it to modern human populations, they found another massive signal of ancient interbreeding. Populations in Australasia today, specifically Melanesians, Papuans, and Aboriginal Australians, carry up to 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes.
And it's vital to emphasize that this staggering complexity isn't just a phenomenon that occurred after humans left Africa.
Right, the mixing didn't just happen in the cold caves of Europe or the mountains of Siberia.
Exactly. Within sub-Saharan Africa, where the climate destroys ancient DNA rapidly, and we don't have genomes from ancient fossils, scientists have used statistical models to look deep into the DNA of modern African populations.
And what did they find?
They have discovered the unmistakable signatures of what they call African ghost lineages.
Ghost lineages. It's a phrase that sounds like science fiction, but it is hard mathematical biology. Let's explain what that actually means.
A ghost lineage is a term used when geneticists analyze the DNA of a modern population and find chunks of genetic material that are incredibly divergent, so different from the rest of the human genome that they could only have come from a completely separate archaic hominin species.
But the ghost aspect comes from the fact that we have absolutely no fossil evidence for this species. No bones, no tools, nothing but the echo of their DNA hiding inside living people.
Exactly. And studies looking at the genomes of modern West and Central African populations, like the Yoruba, the Mende, and the Biaka Pygmies, have found exactly this. They possess between 2 and 19% archaic admixture in their genomes.
That's a huge percentage.
It is. This DNA comes from unknown archaic human lineages that evolutionarily diverged from our direct ancestors up to 700,000 years ago, wandered the African continent for 500,000 years independently, and then, relatively recently, mated with modern Homo sapiens.
One of the most fascinating specific examples of this ghost DNA highlighted in our sources is the mucin 7 gene. This is a highly divergent gene found in high frequencies in several African populations. The mucin 7 gene codes for a specific protein found in saliva.
And saliva proteins might not sound as dramatic as brain shape, but they are crucial for survival.
Oh, totally. Saliva enzymes are the first step in digestion, particularly for breaking down complex starches like tubers and roots. And they also bind to specific microbes, acting as the first line of defense against pathogens in the mouth.
Right. And the version of the mucin 7 gene found in these populations is so genetically distinct that it could not have evolved recently. The mathematical models indicate it was introduced into the modern human gene pool through an ancient interbreeding event with an unknown African hominin.
This culmination of evidence, the early facial modernity at Jebel Irhoud, the continuous flow of tools, the recent exit tracked by the Y chromosome, and the undeniable genetic proof of Neanderthal, Denisovan, and ghost DNA brings us to the current cutting-edge consensus in paleoanthropology.
It is known as the assimilation model.
The assimilation model acts as the grand synthesis. It takes the mathematical reality of the out-of-Africa theory and combines it with the behavioral truth of the multi-regional hypothesis.
Yes, the vast majority of our genetic ancestry, the core of who we are, has a recent origin in Africa.
Yeah.
However, as our ancestors expanded out of their African ranges, they didn't just conquer, they assimilated.
They absorbed the regional, archaic human populations who had already been living in those environments for hundreds of thousands of years.
And this wasn't just accidental mixing, it was an evolutionary superpower.
Think about it. When Homo sapiens migrated into the freezing tundra of Eurasia, they didn't have to wait tens of thousands of years to naturally evolve thicker hair, different fat distribution, or resistance to local, unknown Eurasian diseases.
The Neanderthals and Denisovans had already spent 400,000 years doing the hard evolutionary work of adapting to those brutal environments.
By interbreeding with them, our ancestors effectively downloaded those local genetic adaptations directly into their gene pool. The Neanderthal DNA we carry today still actively influences our immune system responses and our skin and hair structure. We survived the globe by absorbing the species that had already mastered it.
So how do we visualize our past now? The linear march of progress is dead. A simple branching tree where lineages split cleanly and never touch again is equally inaccurate.
I think the most accurate and frankly the most beautiful way to frame human history is to visualize it as a massive, messy, braided river.
A braided river, I like that.
Imagine a vast river delta viewed from above. The main current of humanity flows forward, but constantly splits into separate branches. These branches wander off, flowing separately for 100,000 years, mutating, changing, adapting to new landscapes.
Some branches dry up entirely, the failed waves, the dead ends.
But often, the landscape shifts, the rivers bend, and these deeply separated currents crash back into each other. They intermingle their waters, exchanging genetic material before splitting off again. We are the sum of all those converging currents.
The braided river perfectly captures the sheer glorious chaos of the Pleistocene epoch. If we could transport ourselves back to 300,000 years ago, the Middle Stone Age landscape was a wildly crowded, diverse world.
It wasn't just us waiting in the wings.
No. You had our early Homo Sapiens ancestors with modern faces and primitive brains hunting around the megalakes of Morocco. Simultaneously, deep in the subterranean cave systems of South Africa, you had Homo naledi,
Oh, right, Homo naledi.
a bizarre hominin with a brain the size of an orange yet possessing remarkably human-like manipulative hands and feet somehow burying their dead. You had the massive, robust Homo heidelbergensis still hunting in the forests. In Ice Age Europe, the Neanderthals were building complex societies. In the high altitudes of Asia, the Denisovans were thriving.
It was a world inhabited by multiple, distinct, highly successful ways of being human. We were not alone. We were just one branch in a very dense thicket.
And we are the only branch left standing, but we carry the others with us.
And that brings this entire deep dive directly back to you, the listener. As you are sitting there right now, whether you are commuting to work, prepping for a meeting, or just relaxing at home, I want you to think about the physical machinery of your own body.
It's incredible to reflect on.
The DNA coiled inside your cells right now is not a static blueprint. It is a living, breathing museum of the Pleistocene. Your genome carries the echo of the Moroccan desert from 300,000 years ago. It carries the memory of a tiny group of survivors making a terrifying, desperate crossing of the Red Sea during a glacial freeze.
It actively utilizes the immune adaptations forged in the bitter cold of Neanderthal Europe and the genetic markers adapted to the Denisovan coastlines.
You are the sole survivor of a braided river of humanity that stretches back millions of years.
And the science we've discussed today is not settled. It's moving at an incredible breakneck speed. Every time an archaeologist unearths a new bone or a geneticist sequences a new ancient genome, it has the potential to add a new branch to the river or reveal a new current we didn't know existed.
The map is still being drawn, and I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over. If we only recently, within the last decade, thanks to massive computational leaps, discovered the genetic signature of ghost species hiding in modern genomes, species we never even suspected existed because we have no fossils of them.
What else is hiding in our blood?
Exactly. What other unknown alien human species are currently woven into the background code of isolated populations today, just waiting for our sequencing technology to catch up and finally reveal them?
The diagnostic X-ray of our past may be blurry, but the shapes emerging from the static are incredible.
The picture of our origins isn't a clean straight line. It is gloriously, infinitely messy. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the ground you walk on, keep marveling at the history written in your own cells, and we'll see you next time.